Good morning. I'm Brian Curtis.
And I'm Doug Krisner. Here are the stories we're following today. It was on Sunday in Israel. The TA35 stock index was up 1.3%. Now, analysts over at J.P. Morgan Chase are estimating that the Israeli economy may shrink by 11% on an annualized basis in the fourth quarter. This report was released roughly 24 hours before that ground invasion began. Now, typically in a week where you have a Fed meeting, that would be the main event. Not so much for this week. We've got earnings from Apple. That could get more attention. And another potential pressure point is the Treasury's refunding announcement on Wednesday. We'll take a closer look at that momentarily. In terms of the Fed, though, policymakers are expected to hold that key rate steady in a range of between 5.25% to 5.5%. That, by the way, is a 22-year high. We also have central bank meetings in the week ahead in the UK and in Japan. Now, crude oil in the New York session rallied on Friday when Israel did step up ground operations. WTI finishing at 85.54. We're down right about 0.8% in the electronic session at 84.85. And we'll take another look at market action for you in about 15 minutes. Brian.
Thanks very much. Now it's time for global news. Let's get right over to Ed Baxter in San Francisco. Israel has deepened the war with Hamas. It's a war that has seemingly no end in sight. Ed.
Yeah, exactly right, Brian. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu calling it Phase 2, sending troops and tanks into the northern Gaza Strip.
The war inside the Gaza Strip will be difficult and long, and we are prepared for it.
And Bloomberg's Henry Mayer in Tel Aviv says Israel is using ground troops to gather information that Israel can then use to refine airstrike targets on Hamas.
Hamas is extremely well dug in Gaza. It has a network of hundreds of tunnels which extend across the whole Gaza Strip, and these are very sophisticated facilities which allow them to move equipment and men around.
The U.S. is standing with Israel. National Security Advisor to the President, Jake Sullivan, on ABC, is heard on Bloomberg.
What Israel is trying to do is to ensure that Hamas cannot again present the kind of strategic, systemic threat that it has been posing to the citizens of Israel.
But again, Sullivan says a concern is safety of hostages and civilians in Gaza as well.
Every innocent human life is sacred, and every step must be taken to protect human life, whether that be Palestinian or Israeli or anyone else.
Along with the increase in military activity, there is a call for discussion from the executive director of the Florida chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, Abdul Jabbar.
When we're looking for a ceasefire, when we're looking to even beyond a ceasefire, the call to pause so that you can have these discussions, we're not even seeing that opportunity come up.
And the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, says there will be work this week on funding for Israel. He expects to have it by the end of the week. With the GOP field narrowing for the presidential nomination, Mike Pence drops out. Chris Christie on CNN says the party faces strong challenges as Donald Trump's legal woes are mounting. Christie, let me find that for you. Here we go. Christie on CNN.
Donald Trump is not going to be able to beat Joe Biden from a courtroom in Washington, D.C. while he's fighting his indictment on the January 6th case. And let me tell you, that indictment got much tougher for him to beat when his own chief of staff has now accepted immunity and will testify against him about the lies he told in the aftermath of January 6th.
And he says the party needs to get rid of Trump, move on to debate between the party's strong leaders. China's foreign minister Wang Yi says the road to San Francisco summit will not be a smooth one. This is a reference to the expected meeting between President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden. This after his meeting with U.S. Secretary of State Blinken the end of last week. They did agree to work together to make it happen, and the U.S. is saying it will come together. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now in San Francisco. I'm Ed Baxter. This is Bloomberg. Brian?
Ed, thanks very much. Let's get to some of the top stories here. Egypt saying that its natural gas imports have ground to a halt. It reflects the impact of the Gaza conflict on the North African nation. It could also dash hopes of a resumption of exports to Europe. The halt in gas imports appears linked to a decision earlier this month by Israel to shut down the offshore Tamar gas field. That's amid concerns that the field could be damaged by the fighting between Israel's military and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Chevron operates the Tamar field. It could not be reached for immediate comment. However, the company did say on Friday it has continued to honor some of its contracts with Egypt.
Well, the Fed's decision on Wednesday may take a backseat to another potential market-moving event. Speaking here of the Treasury's new borrowing plan, the so-called quarterly refunding announcement. It's due just hours before the Fed's decision, and this will detail how the Treasury intends to ramp up sales of longer-term government debt as of funding a wider budget deficit. Christopher Harvey is the head of equity strategy at Wells Fargo.
If the Treasury announces and they don't need as much paper as people suspect, or they come in line with expectations, that's a good thing. If the FOMC plays ball and says, okay, we're done, we're good here for now, that could stabilize the markets.
That is Christopher Harvey from Wells Fargo. By the way, Bloomberg Intelligence is projecting gross coupon auction amounts will rise by between $1 to $2 billion across the curve over the next 6 months, with the exception of the 20 and 30-year bonds. Brian?
Well, Stellantis has reached a tentative deal with the United Auto Workers, ending the union's 6-week-old strike with the company. The deal reached on Saturday includes a 25% hourly pay raise, plus cost of living allowances. It matches the agreement reached with Ford earlier last week. In a video posted on X, UAW President Shawn Fain praised the deal.
Once again, we've achieved what just weeks ago we were told was impossible. The power of the stand-up strike cannot be understated. Over the 44 days we were on strike, Stellantis more than doubled the total value of the proposals they had on the table.
That's Shawn Fain. The union said that on top of Stellantis reopening the plant, the company would also add more than 1,000 jobs at a new battery plant in Belvidere in Illinois. Stellantis is now negotiating to head off a strike at its Canadian operations.
Australia has walked away from negotiations on a free trade deal with the European Union for the second time in 3 months. More from Bloomberg's Paul Allen in Sydney.
A free trade deal between Australia and the European Union has been on the table for 5 years now, and while there's broad agreement over almost everything, a couple of small sticking points have proven insurmountable. Australia wants greater access for its beef, mutton and sugar. Last week, Australia's National Farmers Federation called the deal as it stands a dud. Europe, meanwhile, wants Australia to stop using geographical indicators like Prosecco, Parmesan and Feta to describe some of its wine and cheeses. Australia's Trade Minister says negotiations will continue, and he hopes someday a deal can be signed. Paul Allen, Bloomberg Radio.
Evergrande will face a make-or-break moment today at a court hearing on liquidation in Hong Kong. Bloomberg's Joanne Wong has that story from Hong Kong.
The lawsuit here in Hong Kong has been lingering for almost 17 months. That's after multiple delays requested by Evergrande. A group of creditors that had previously supported the firm's restructuring plan is now wavering. The so-called ad hoc bloc has yet to decide whether it will speak out against the winding up request. That's despite the fact they did so previously. The creditors hold more than $6 billion of the builder's $19 billion of offshore notes. If a wind-up order is delivered, Evergrande could become the biggest ever developer to face such a fate under Hong Kong law. In Hong Kong, I'm Joanne Wong, Bloomberg Radio.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. I'm Brian Curtis, along with Rashad Salamat, and our guest is Kirsten Fontenrose, president of Red 6 Solutions. Kirsten, thanks very much for being with us here live on the program. So Israel's push into northern Gaza is perhaps a little more cautious than was feared by some, but it's still coming under quite a lot of criticism. How real is it in your mind that the spread of this war continues?
The spread is very likely, but escalation is a separate issue. So we're seeing activity by groups that are also backed by Iran that constitute spread because they're happening on different fronts. They're happening in Lebanon, or drones are being fired from Yemen, for example. But that doesn't necessarily mean we're looking at escalation to a wider war. What this does look like is that these groups, again, backed by Iran, are trying to spread Israel thin. They are trying to spread Israel's capabilities to respond on multiple fronts very, very thin, to force them to stay vigilant on all these different fronts, spreading out their forces, spreading out their defensive technology systems to make it easier for Hamas to fight them. So it may not mean that these groups are getting involved full scale into a regional war. It does, though, definitely mean that they're trying to make the fight harder for Israel at home against Hamas.
Well, also here, when we look at what's going on in the region, as you say, spreading it, and Kirsten, I mean, the role of Hezbollah will be very important in the future with regards to this, and also very central to what Iran has been saying of late.
Extremely important. To your point, Hezbollah is a greater threat than Hamas is to Israel. The U.S. Treasury has designated over 1,600 individuals and entities that are linked to terrorism and terrorist financing by the Iranian regime and its militias across the Middle East, and Hezbollah is the prominent one. Iran gives roughly $700 million a year to support terrorist groups, including Hezbollah, and up to $100 million annually to Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist groups. So with the involvement of something like Hezbollah, as you see, getting 7 times the amount of annual support from Iran, they have stockpiled weapons and capabilities and technologies that the other groups do not have. So they would be a much more formidable foe if they chose to get involved. This is why the U.S. has said if they do get involved in a way that Israel can't handle on its own, the U.S. could then potentially be pulled in, which could then trigger something larger, the regional escalation you're talking about.
I wonder if other groups might feel a little different, given that Israel's stated goal here is a little different than before. In the past, Hamas was often damaged but left standing. This time, Israel is talking about destroying Hamas once and for all. Is that realistic? And does it send a strong message to groups like Hezbollah?
It certainly does send a strong message, and it impacts their calculus. One of the things we don't know per group is how it impacts it. There's 2 potential ways. One is these groups could say Israel has threatened to completely destroy this organization that is a critical cog in our network. We can't let that happen. So if it looks like we're heading in that direction, we will get involved. We will risk it all because we together need to be a fighting force. This would be unprecedented. So it would be unlikely. There's another option where they would say, because Israel has decided they want to destroy this organization, we have quite a bit to lose. Hezbollah right now runs a country. It is the power behind the government in Lebanon. And Lebanon has a failed economy. It is not in a good place, but it still sits at the head of the state in that government. That would be quite a lot to risk if you're Hezbollah. Do you want to put that on the line to go to war with Israel and potentially the U.S., knowing you could then lose everything for an organization that is not necessarily critical to your survival or your own goals? So we are trying to figure out constantly, what do each of these groups think is in it for them to enter this fight more robustly?
Well, Kristen, I mean, we talk about these military responses, but, it's the same old playbook of violence begetting more violence. Surely there's a better way of dealing with this. There must be an intelligent solution long term rather than this circle we find ourselves in the Middle East.
You would hope so. Unfortunately, one of the lessons we believe some of these groups are learning is that terrorism works. So if you allow Hamas to succeed, if you allow them to conduct a strike like they did on October 7th and murder as many civilians as they did in such a way, and then you say, we are going to answer that with a calm that does not in any way impede its ability to do that kind of strike again, then you have sent them the message that you get what you want by using terrorism. That's one of the things that the U.S., Israel, and European and other governments are thinking about now. How do we stop the bloodshed without sending the message that this has been an effective tactic on the part of Hamas to draw more attention to the grievances they had inside Israel? Can't let that stand. So, and then making this more difficult, as I'm sure you've discussed many times, is Hamas's use of humans for shields, making it very difficult for Israel to complete its stated goals of going in and eliminating the leadership and their ability to conduct terrorism from Israel. They build their bunkers under hospitals and schools and mosques. So there will be collateral damage when you go in to try to uproot them. So how do you balance that? How much risk is any country willing to take with their own civilians and with hostages from other countries? It's very tough for Israel right now.
It begs the question, Kirsten, if even though this is a more limited response by Israel, it's starting to stretch other countries' patience on this. Is Israel kind of losing some of the goodwill that it had in the beginning of this?
They are losing some of the goodwill, and part of that is because of a massive disinformation campaign that's been quite effective by not only Iran and its proxies, but also other adversaries of the U.S. and the West that are simply enjoying the luxury of amplifying some of that disinformation because it makes their adversaries here in the West look poorly. So you're seeing usage of footage from previous conflicts, for instance, then attributed to Israeli IDF forces inaccurately. You're seeing stories that are made up. There's enough bad going on the ground that this doesn't need to be done, but we're seeing it. And this is then contributing to this lack of empathy for Israel. And people are forgetting what happened on October 7th, forgetting that Hamas threw this first punch. It's also a David and Goliath thing. Israel is more capable. It is more militarily supported. So it always looks like, the underdog is always the one you feel some sympathy for. And that does make it hard. And then Hamas very well knew that by bunkering themselves underneath places where civilians would be gathered, like mosques and schools and hospitals, it would make it really hard.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, your morning brief on the stories making news from Hong Kong to Singapore and Wall Street.
Look for us on your podcast feed every day on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each day on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, Sirius XM Channel 119, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Brian Curtis.
And I'm Doug Krisner. Join us again tomorrow for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.